Our topic for today is requirements for conducting an administrative study and the requirements for developing Chapter 2 of an administrative study for either a research proposal or a final research report. So we're going to really discuss what a Chapter 2 literature review is, what it's all about, and how to develop it. We're going to cover the following topics. Why do we do literature reviews? Why review the literature? The relationship between the research questions that precede Chapter 2 that are located in Chapter 1 and the literature Chapter 2. We'll discuss how to find related literature, what to do with it once you find it, how to review it and extract information. And then finally, how to write a preliminary final literature review with pointers along the way about how to cite sources and a few comments about the references section that we've covered in past discussions. So an administrative study looks like this. You've seen this diagram before if you've listened to earlier lectures. You have an organization at the top. You've based on your focus or your concentration in the MSA program, you've constructed a problem, a challenge, an issue, or an opportunity facing the organization. Then you commenced your study. You wrote your Chapter 1, which gave the background of the organization and the problem. Also discussed the problem or issue itself, structured as a primary research question, and then the primary research question was decomposed into very related specific sub-questions that all sort of tie back. We took the primary research question and we broke it into smaller pieces. That's what we did in Chapter 1. So now we have to begin to seek out information to help us answer the research question. So that's the subject of this lecture today, this discussion. You can see on the diagram what's been circled is Chapter 2 literature review, which is part of the research proposal. Also, at the end of your program, it's the final literature review, which is a bit more expanded, a bit more comprehensive, but it still remains as Chapter 2 in either your research proposal or your final research report. We'll continue with other topics on this diagram in future lectures, either from myself or your primary instructor. So just a reminder of some writing requirements. We've gone over these before, but this is a condensed set of notes. Make sure that in your proposal and your final research report that the spacing is according to APA. The only page in the entire report that can be single-spaced is the cover page. Now this doesn't include your surveys or your consent forms, which may have a different format, but it includes everything else. So remember that everything is double-spaced, including the references. Also remember there's no blank lines. We don't have spaces between the end of a subsection and the beginning of the next subsection. We don't have blanks or spacing between paragraphs or any place else. Everything is double-spaced in the entire report with no extra spacing. We start Chapter 2 at the top of a new page. We cite all sources in the chapter. Chapter 2, since it's a review of related literature, really is filled with citations because very little in Chapter 2 is going to be our own work. The beginning certainly and the summary at the end and some transitional sentences and maybe an occasional comment, but most of what's in Chapter 2 is a paraphrasing of content from other sources. So we expect to see lots of citations in Chapter 2. Make sure you indent all paragraphs. Students sometimes forget this. So go back and make sure that every paragraph is indented without exception. Numbers 0 through 9 are spelled out. Numbers greater than 9 are in numeral format. And never ever start a sentence with a number. Always spell it out. Make sure you have no mini paragraphs. That's a paragraph of one sentence. Make sure you have no mini subsections. That's a subsection with only one paragraph. And make sure you have no paragraphs of doom, which are long paragraphs where the indentation has been ignored and you really don't have a paragraph. You just have a stream of consciousness. If there's an entire page with no indentation, you've got a paragraph of doom. So avoid the paragraphs of doom. No personal pronouns in research, I, our, we, or my. We want to be seen as independent, we the writer, of the work, and therefore no personal pronouns. Use bullet lists sparingly. You're not writing an outline. And be careful about run-on sentences and sentence fragments. You've heard all that before. So let's talk about why we do a literature review. Why do we do a literature review? The primary purpose of reviewing related studies is to try to find answers to the questions that were posed in Chapter 1 of the research proposal or research report. So we're searching for causes to a problem. We're also searching for any other insight related to the problem that may be causal or just interesting or useful in other contexts. And we're searching for any potential solutions that other studies have identified to the problems that we're trying to investigate. There are some secondary reasons why we research literature. We do it to become more knowledgeable about the subject. People who go on TV and say that they're experts in international nuclear proliferation treaties, etc., are people who've reviewed every piece of literature available and are experts on the subject matter. So if you wanted to be an expert on any particular subject matter, you comprehensively review all related literature, and therefore that positions you as a subject matter expert. We also learn how others have approached similar problems, and that can be a very useful thing when we're conducting a study. You know, what did they do a survey? Did they interview subject matter experts? How did they approach this? So, definition of a literature review. We're trying to locate, summarize, and discuss published information, related studies in a particular subject area. So we locate related studies that have examined similar issues. They don't have to be exactly the same as the issue we're trying to examine, but similar type studies. So we might be looking at turnover in an emergency room, and so we can't find any studies that have ever done that. So we look at a turnover in healthcare, and if we can't find anything there, we look at turnover amongst nonprofit organizations or turnover as the highest level subject. So we can always find related literature, but we're trying to find studies that are as close to ours as possible. That's where we start. And we provide a synthesis. So once we get our studies collected, we provide a synthesis of all the scholarly and the professional work that's been done related to the study that we're undertaking. We present the work that's already been done. Does not present that's already been done. It doesn't really represent new scholarship. We're going to get to that ourselves because we're going to collect data as well. But literature is really about studies that have been completed. And we're going to make sure that it's organized in a pattern that supports our research issue. We'll talk about this in a second. Synthesis means organizing the facts from various studies in a way that makes sense for our study. It's not really a summary of each article, and that's important to understand. If what you've done in a research proposal that you submit is a linear review of related studies, that's not going to cut it because that's not a literature review, and so that needs to be redone. A few more literature review requirements. A preliminary review for the research proposal. A typical Chapter 2, an acceptable Chapter 2 would be about 7 pages, 8 or more articles. However, that's not acceptable for a final research report because evaluation criteria for final research reports are that the literature review is reasonably comprehensive. And so we expect that comprehensive probably implies that we have at least 12 pages and at least 15 articles. Writing requirements for Chapter 2, it's written using expository form. We have that means we have subsections, paragraphs, and sentences, not long lists of bullet items, not an outline. Limited use of outline format, not a lot of bullet lists. One of the most frustrating things for an instructor is to get a Chapter 2 from a student where a student said the following study or Kessler 2000 found the following, and then just a list of bullets. And that's really just not something that we do typically in a Chapter 2. Limited use of direct quotes. It's not a favorable thing for a student to submit something where the quote starts at the top of a page and ends at the bottom of a page. We generally try to paraphrase because we're really trying to condense or summarize large, vast amounts of literature, and therefore including quotes de-powers us from the ability to include a review of extensive literature. So avoid use of direct quotes. And all citations, as been discussed in the past and will be discussed here as well, have to be in the APA 6th edition format. Make sure that you listen to the lecture on APA 6th edition requirements and writing requirements for your administrative study, because that lecture really spends a lot of time on how to do citations. So how do we do a literature review? First, we recognize that what we're trying to do is go locate literature, and in reviewing that literature, find answers or useful information to help answer our research questions. So that's really important. Now, the second thing to recognize is we don't just take our, and I've had students do this before, we don't just take our research questions from Chapter 1 and they become the subsections. We simply don't do that. First of all, subsection generally is not written as in question format. And secondly, the literature may cross-cut multiple research questions. So we generally try to disassociate the exact research questions from the subsections in Chapter 2. Recognize that, well, here's an example on the screen. For example, for addressing issues related to the topic of how employee compensation issues are impacting turnover. So we've got two topics here, right? We've got employee compensation issues and we've got impacting turnover. Literature review might focus on 4 to maybe 7 subtopics. And these were examples if we're really investigating why employee compensation in an organization, whether compensation issues are really a causal factor for turnover. Excuse me. So we might examine recent research on compensation methods, influence on compensation on motivation, the relationship between compensation and turnover, compensation studies in the healthcare profession, let's assume it's a healthcare organization, and compensation impact on the bottom line. So that would just be an example of how we could take a general issue and sort of say, well, let's see, what kinds of things might have been studied that are going to help us look at in this healthcare organization at whether or not compensation is really causing turnover. And so we sort of disassociate the research questions directly from the topics that we try to find. Okay, just one last comment here, and then we'll get into how to find related literature. What are different kinds of literature? There's really 3 general types of literature. There's the popular literature, which is typically authored by journalists, generally appears in magazines or newspapers, very brief, addresses sort of like general topics of interest to the public, and it's kind of, sometimes they're glossy and they include photos and other color fonts. Downside of this, and you should really avoid this in a literature review, is that this stuff is really, these are more opinion pieces by journalists. These are generally not factually driven content that we like to use to be able to intellectually and through data answer our research questions. Now, as we get into the sort of the trade and the professional publications, we can recognize that these are more likely to be authored by practitioners or scholars. They still tend to be brief. They provide sort of news and trends about sort of professional-like activities. They address practical issues and communicate ideas and recommendations for solving problems. And sometimes they're anecdotal. There's other kinds of trade publications as well, like manuals. A lot of military types like to go to the policies and procedures manuals or a particular manual on a particular type of equipment or a strategy or whatever. So in the trade domain, this can range far and wide. And then we get to the important thing, which is scholarly work, because a lot of what you need to do for administrative studies and research is to use scholarly work, because scholarly is considered the highest quality. They're generally authored by people who are considered experts in their field or scholars. They're printed in refereed journals. Now, to get an article published in a refereed journal, you submit the article to the journal, and it gets reviewed by a panel of your peers. And if the peers say, no, it's not of high enough quality to get in the journal, you don't get into the journal. So you know that anything that appears in a journal has been deemed of reasonably high quality by a panel of related scholars who know the subject reasonably well. They tend to be medium. Scholarly articles tend to be medium and long in length. Sometimes they have a lot of math. I typically am not interested in the math. I'm interested in how these articles have reviewed the literature. What does their review of the literature say? And what conclusions they developed. And that's what you should be interested in as well. Excuse me. Recognize also that scholarly literature generally presents the results of research studies. And so they're often very useful. And that's what you're looking for as you do your literature review for your administrative study. Now let's talk about how to do the deed, how to find related literature. So first thing you need to do is take your primary question or primary research issue in Chapter 1 and the sub-questions and just examine it for a bit. Then you need to sort of figure out, based on looking at that, what kind of studies are you likely to find? And so I have examples on this page. If the issue is the reason morale is low, I'm going to be looking at subjects like motivation, morale, job satisfaction, trends in the military, if it's the military, or automotive or healthcare. So I always try to find something industry specific if I can if I can do so. Another issue with feasibility of opening up a coffee shop, I would be looking at entrepreneurship studies, success or failure rates for new businesses, lots of studies on that. Competition in the coffee shop business, I bet you I could find some pretty good articles there. Challenges in leaving a permanent job to become an entrepreneur. And you can just think about the kinds of things, obtaining financing, starting a business in a city or an area that is an up-and-coming area, or whatever. So you just have to be creative in trying to think of what kind of studies you might find. The final example here is problems with military recruiting or retention, and I get a lot of those studies. How military conflict impacts recruiting, ops tempo it's called. Outcomes of reenlistment bonuses, because there's always debates about whether to offer or not offer reenlistment bonuses. Military strategies for increasing recruiting, challenges in an all-volunteer recruiting and retention environment, because we don't have the draft anymore. So there's just lots of issues. You could look at examine experiences in trying to recruit non-males, females in the military or whatever. So those are examples of how to figure out what your attack plan is going to be. Then you take those subtopics that you come up with and you get busy. And the way you get busy is you look at your different sources. Now, many students like to go out to the internet and see what they can find, and that's all they do. And often there's a bit of instructor feedback that's not positive about that, because generally we tend not to find scholarly work published on the internet. Scholarly work generally tends to be found through databases where journals can be accessed, scholarly journals, referee journals. So typically I encourage everyone to go and use the CMU Global Campus Library Services. Now this semester you've been given a lecture on the Global Campus Library Services, and you learn some amazing things. You learn about something called Google Scholar. Generally if you use Google, you don't get to the scholarly articles, but there is something called Google Scholar that you can use, but you have to sort of get to it through your CMU Access account. So make sure that you listen to the CMU Global Campus presentation or lecture, and then recognize it's going to tell you that, and this is my opinion, and I think it's a widely held opinion, that our Central Michigan University really has an outstanding library and outstanding full-time librarians, especially supporting our online classes. So you can go to Global Campus Library Services, and you can consult with the librarian if you want. There's good reason to do that, which I'll talk about in a second. Or you can just get in and do the work yourself. You can select a research option. Generally, you're going to want to go into a research database. The best research database is ABI Inform to search for all articles. And when you go in and you start to do a search on ABI Inform for articles, it's useful if you click the option that says full article, because otherwise it comes back and just gives you sort of like a brief review of the article. And then it's important that when you get articles, the studies that you find very useful, that you download them onto your computer so you can spend your own time studying those things, and also so you can do your citations when the time comes for identification of the sources for those articles, that you have the article available to find the source information. Okay, this is just I'm just going to blow through this because this is just extracted from the Global Campus Library Services presentation. But remember what I said, this is your search criteria for ABI Inform. Be sure to check the boxes here where it says full text only, and there's another box there that says scholarly journals, including peer-reviewed. So you can check that, and you can just get scholarly work. And when you do that and you do a search for something, it comes back and gives you the articles, and you can sort of see down below in the three examples, the first one that came back does not have the PDF file. And so for me, I'd just skip right over that and I'd be going. So if you check the box above that says only PDF, then that one would be excluded. And the librarians themselves are a fantastic resource. We have 4 or 5 full-timers who sit around and wait to provide assistance to students. Not only can they provide you assistance, if you give them sort of like the general idea of what you're looking for, they can also help you find data. And finding data is really important. So if you're looking for like economic data for a certain town or something, the librarians can say, well, we might be able to locate that data at this source or that source or whatever. So they're very good about that. They're also very good about finding surveys and other data collection instruments, because there's directories that they have that have thousands and thousands of studies on topics that you might be able to consult with as well. So consider contacting the librarians. From my perspective, they're a resource we don't use enough. And this is an example of the kinds of questions about that you can ask them for, like you're looking for literature about a certain subject, or you're looking for a survey that examines this, or you're looking for statistics or other information about something else. Okay, let's talk about what to do once you've collected your articles. Let's assume now that you have your 15 articles and they're piled up on your dining room table. I fondly recall when I was doing my doctoral dissertation how my dining room table was covered with stacks and stacks and stacks of related studies, because for doctoral work you need many, many studies. You don't get away with 15. So here's topic 3, which is reviewing articles and extracting information. And this is my technique. This is what I suggest. So I suggest that you take the topics, the strategies you were thinking about before, like motivation, reasons why there's turnover in healthcare, etc. You take the topics that you teased out of your research questions, and you create a pad for each of those topics, a blank pad. And you put the blank pad on your table, and you got 4 different blank pads if you have 4 topics or whatever. And so and you can see it says that here on the bottom of the article. So I've got my issue. And so my major issue was problems with military recruiting and retention. And so now I've got a different pad. I got a pad that says how military conflict impacts recruiting, outcomes of reenlistment bonuses, another pad, military strategies for increasing recruitment, and challenges in all volunteer recruiting and retention environments. I have 4 different pads. So I take my first article, and with my first article, I number the article. So when I write something down, I'll put that number down so I know when I have to write my citations later which article these information came from. So I take my very first article and I go completely through the article from the beginning to the end, and I extract facts and I put them on any of the 4 pads. And very often you'll find a research study that has information about multiple topics you're examining. And by having the 4 different pads, you pull information. Now make sure you write number 1 beside each time you write the fact down on the sheet. You write the number 1 as well, so you know it came from article number 1. Once you're at the end of the study, the number 1 study, you put a check by it, say you reviewed it, and you put it aside. Then you go to the second research study, you write number 2 at the top, and you commence going through that. By the time you finish all the studies in your pile and you've filled your 4 pads with information, you've done what we term a synthesis rather than an article-by-article review. You now have these 4 pads that you can commence to write your subsections in Chapter 2. And so that's the way that you really need to approach taking related literature and organizing it in a way that makes sense for your study. How do you write the chapter 2? And the way you write it, you're going to include the following things. You're going to include a sort of an introduction or an overview of the subject or theory under consideration. Maybe discuss the objectives of the literature review. Then you're going to include your subsections, 1 subsection for each of your pads. And then finally, you're going to include a summary at the bottom of Chapter 2. This summary is extremely important. It shouldn't be just kind of glossed over. You don't want to just say, this chapter reviewed important information. The information is very useful. That summary tells you nothing. What you need to do is go back through the 7 pages or the 15 pages that you've written and put a check mark beside really important stuff that answers the research questions, and then transport those things that you checked to the summary at the bottom of Chapter 2. The reason this is important is eventually you're going to have to write Chapter 5. When you write Chapter 5, one of the subsections is called Summary, and you're going to have to pull all the information from Chapter 2, as well as Chapter 4, which we haven't talked about yet, into Chapter 5, and that's really important. So the summary at the end of Chapter 2 is extremely important, and don't slight it. Don't just blow through it because you're tired of writing and you want to get done. CMU's Online Writing Center, remember when you write, you have to edit stuff. Don't submit stuff to your instructor that hasn't been edited. When stuff comes in, it's full of formatting errors and grammatical problems and typos. The instructors just roll their eyes and they're already, you are facing a tough challenge because the instructor has formed an assessment that that the content's probably not good because it's not edited, it's not formatted correctly. So don't put yourself up against it. Make sure you get this stuff edited, right? Use the Online Writing Center, which is easy to use. Send this Chapter 2 to the Writing Center. In a day or a day and a half, you get it back again with edits and comments. And recognize that the Writing Center takes 24 to 48 hours, so you can't wait till Sunday night when something's due to start having it edited. And also weekends tend to be a little slower for the Writing Center, so you got to get something done maybe on Thursday to get it back by Saturday. Now, if this doesn't work out and the Writing Center is not going to work for you, then get somebody you know to edit something for you. I've said that more times than I need to say it. Have your work edited before you submit it. Some helpful pointers about writing Chapter 2. In the proposal, the literature review should be at least 7 pages. It says, there's a little typo here. Let me correct that real quick while you're watching here. So you should correct this. The final research report should be at least 12 pages in length, and that's important. Make sure that everything in the chapter is double-spaced. Make sure there's no blank lines between subsections and paragraphs. Make sure you cite all sources using APA format. No long sections without citations. Recognize the purpose here is to summarize and cite related studies, so citations are necessary, and you won't have long stretches without citations. No weird citations where the citation sits between a sentence. Every citation in a chapter has to be within a punctuation mark. If this is the first time you've heard this stated, then you have not watched the APA lecture, and go back and watch the APA lecture so you know how to do your citations. This is really important. And then finally, extract facts from each article, each related study that relates to your Chapter 1 research questions. That's really the mission of Chapter 2. It's what you're after. You're after facts to help answer your research questions, not opinions. Some more helpful pointers about Chapter 2. No one-sentence paragraphs. I've said this earlier. No one-paragraph subsections. No paragraphs of doom. Have your work edited. Extract the key facts from Chapter 2 and bring them down into the summary. It's really important. For submissions to your instructor, always submit the entire proposal. Don't just submit a Chapter 2. Sometimes students say, "Professor, I cannot find literature," and that's not a good thing to say to your instructor, because your instructor knows there's always literature. You just had to broaden your acceptable range of what literature you're looking for. Final couple of comments here. Remember, you're using the proposal template. The proposal template sort of looks like this. I know this is hard to see, but it's quite straightforward. You can see comments on the right-hand side. You can see an introduction to the literature, which is your transitional paragraphs talking about the fact that literature is important because it's going to help answer the questions posed in Chapter 1, that there's extensive literature on the subject, or literature was challenging to locate, or whatever your thing was. And then in the last paragraph here, say that the following categories of literature are presented in the following pages. And then you can list the 4 or 5 subtopics that you have. Then you commence your presentation of literature. And where it says literature, subtitle 1, completely replace that. Don't leave that around. And put your topic in, motivation in healthcare environment, or whatever. Next slide just shows you more subsections. Again, where it says literature subtitle 2, replace it with your subtopic title. Literature subtitle 3, and so on. And just note that there's comments out in the right-hand column that are in the research proposal. Finally, at the end, summary of literature, and I'm going to read you what it says. Sometimes students write summaries that are not particularly useful. There are just a few sentences repeating the purpose of a literature review rather than substantive content. This summary, however, is very important. Carefully extract the key facts cited in the preceding pages and link them to the research sub-questions presented in Chapter 1. The entire purpose of Chapter 2 is to locate and review related studies and to extract facts from those studies that help answer the research questions. It's the primary purpose of conducting a literature review. Use these final paragraphs to summarize the extent of the literature and major points from the literature that support, aid, or refute the research problem and subproblems. This summary is important because it will be used later when the final research report is written as evidence for the final research conclusions and recommendations. At the end, you're going to have your references section. You've seen this before. There's nothing new here. Make sure that every reference, everything that you cited, every citation in Chapter 2, is included in your references list. Make sure your references are double-spaced in alphabetical order, and make sure that every citation from Chapter 2 and Chapter 1 is included in the reference list. The references should not be located at the end of Chapter 2. They're located after Chapter 5 at the end. So continue using the proposal template. Don't delete the interceding sections because you'll need them later. But do update your references. Make sure they're double-spaced and hanging indentation style. I hope this has been helpful. More discussion about other topics later from either your instructor or from me.